The crystal glass shattered against the wall, sending shards of expensive crystal across the pristine marble floor of the executive meeting room. Richard Sterling hadn't moved from his leather chair at the head of the table, his cold gaze fixed on the trembling executive standing before him. But before we dive in the story, let me know where in the world you're watching from, and please, don't forget to subscribe and help me reach 1,000 friends until the end of November. Incompetent, Richard said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of disdain that had become his trademark in Manhattan's corporate world. Do you have any idea how much your mistake cost us, Thompson? The executive, a man in his 50s who had spent 20 years building his career, struggled to maintain his composure. Mr. Sterling, if you'd just let me explain the market conditions. Market conditions? Richard's laugh was devoid of humor. He stood slowly, his tailored Armani suit moving without a wrinkle. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, tall, fit, with precisely grayed temples that spoke of experience rather than age. The market doesn't make mistakes, Thompson. People do. Weak people. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Richard, Manhattan's skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to power and ambition. His building, the Sterling Tower, stood among the tallest, its shadow falling across smaller structures like a king's crown over subjects. "Clear out your office," Richard said, straightening his platinum cufflinks. "Security will escort you out. Consider yourself lucky I'm not suing for damages." As Thompson stumbled out, Richard's assistant Patricia slipped in, her steps careful to avoid the broken glass. "Sir, your son—" "I don't have a son." The words came automatically, sharp enough to make Patricia flinch. It was an old rule. Never mention family, especially not that. Never. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling. I meant to say there's a situation downstairs. A street boy is causing trouble at the main entrance. Security wants to know how to proceed." For a moment, brief enough to miss if you weren't looking, something flickered across Richard's face. He turned to the window, his reflection overlaying the city below. In the distance, dark clouds gathered, promising one of Manhattan's infamous thunderstorms. "Call the police," he said. "I won't have vagrant children disturbing my employees." Flash forward, 6 hours later. The same office, but now rain lashed against the windows, and Richard sat alone in the darkness, a DNA test report trembling in his hands. The same hands that had gestured dismissively at security, ordering them to remove that dirty street child. The same hands that had once, 15 years ago, signed away rights to a baby boy. "Mr. Sterling?" Patricia's voice brought him back. "The board members are waiting in conference room A for the quarterly review." Richard straightened his tie, checking his reflection in the window. Perfect, as always. Everything was perfect. His empire had grown from a single real estate investment into the Sterling Group, a conglomerate that owned half of Manhattan's prime properties. Forbes had featured him last month. The king of Manhattan real estate, Richard Sterling. Unstoppable rise. He strode through the corridors of the 50th floor, his shoes clicking against imported Italian marble. Employees scrambled to get out of his way, their eyes down, muttering quick good mornings that he didn't acknowledge. Fear was efficient. Fear kept people in line. The boardroom fell silent as he entered. 12 of USA's top executives all waiting for his word. This was power. This was control. "The Q3 reports," he began, but his eye caught something. There, in the reflection of the strategic planning screen, he saw his father's face instead of his own. The same cold eyes, the same dismissive sneer. The face that had once told him, "Kindness is weakness, son. In this world, you're either predator or prey." Richard blinked, and the image was gone. He reached into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the small key he always carried. The key to his office's bottom drawer, where a single photograph lay face down. A baby boy in a hospital blanket taken 15 years ago. "Sir?" One of the board members ventured. "The reports?" Richard's face hardened. Sentiment was weakness. The past was past. He had built this empire by being ruthless, by never letting emotion cloud his judgment. He was Richard Sterling, the man who had everything. "The Q3 reports show a 15% increase in revenue," he continued, his voice cold and controlled. But that's not enough. I want 25% by year's end, and anyone who can't contribute to that goal should start updating their resume. Outside, the gathering storm grew darker, and somewhere on the streets below, a boy walked through the rain, carrying a secret that would shatter Richard's perfect world. In his pocket, the key felt suddenly heavy, like the weight of 15 years of denial pressed into metal. But Richard Sterling didn't believe in karma or cosmic justice. He believed in power, in control, in the empire he'd built on the foundation of his own ruthlessness. After all, he was the man who had everything. He just didn't know, not yet, how quickly everything could crumble. Richard Sterling's morning routine was a masterpiece of precision. At exactly 5:30 a.m., he was already on the treadmill in his penthouse gym, watching financial markets scroll across multiple screens. Hong Kong closing, London opening, futures hinting at what Wall Street would do. Power, he had learned early, required constant vigilance. "Your ex-wife called again." His personal assistant's voice came through the intercom at 7 a.m., just as he was finishing his protein shake. "She wants to discuss the foundation's annual gala. Tell Helena that, unless she's calling about business properties, I'm not interested." He adjusted his tie in the mirror, examining his reflection with clinical precision. "And cancel my dinner with the mayor." Something more important came up. That something was a potential acquisition. A struggling boutique hotel chain that would fit perfectly into his portfolio once he stripped it down and rebuilt it in his image. The fact that the owner was an old friend meant nothing. In fact, it made it more satisfying. The elevator ride down to his private parking garage gave him time to review the morning's casualties. 3 departments would be restructured today, a euphemism his HR department had learned to use instead of mass firing. Efficiency over emotion, always. His Maserati purred to life, but as he pulled out onto the street, something caught his eye. A boy, maybe 14 or 15, was digging through the dumpster behind his building. For a moment, the scene struck him like a physical blow. The boy's dark hair, the set of his shoulders. Richard's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where an old photograph burned in his inner pocket. He'd grabbed it that morning without knowing why, breaking his rule about keeping it locked away. "Get out of there!" The building's security guard was already moving toward the boy. "Mr. Sterling doesn't want your kind around here." The boy looked up, and for a split second, his eyes met Richard's through the car window. There was something in that gaze, a defiance, a dignity that seemed oddly familiar. Richard pressed the accelerator, leaving the scene behind. By the time he reached his office, he had almost convinced himself he hadn't seen it at all. "Your 9 a.m. is waiting," Patricia announced as he strode through the office. "And the team from marketing wants to know if you've reviewed their proposal." "Fire them," Richard said without breaking stride. "All of them. Their numbers have been slipping for months. Have security ready." "The entire department?" "Did I stutter, Patricia? And get me Roberts from legal. If we're going to gut that hotel chain, I want everything in place." The morning blurred into a series of calculated cruelties. The marketing team left in tears, 40 people whose lives he'd just upended. The hotel chain's owner, Mark, an old university friend, begged on the phone. "Richard, please. This hotel was my father's dream. We just need time to—" "Dreams don't pay dividends, Mark. You have until Friday to accept the offer, or I'll make sure every bank in the United States knows about your creative accounting." "You would do this? After 20 years of friendship?" Richard ended the call without responding. Through his office window, he watched the marketing team leaving the building, boxes in hand. Some were crying, some were angry. None of it touched him. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Lunch was a power play at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, where he deliberately kept a potential investor waiting for 30 minutes before arriving. The man, a Saudi prince looking to diversify his portfolio, smiled tightly as Richard sat down. "Time is precious, Mr. Sterling." "Yes," Richard agreed. not bothering to apologize. That's why I charge $10 million an hour for mine. Shall we discuss terms? But even as he negotiated, his mind kept drifting to that boy in the dumpster. There was something about him, something that made the old photograph feel like it was burning through his suit jacket. Back at the office, the afternoon brought more casualties. 2 project managers fired for a 2% decline in productivity. A cleaning woman dismissed because she had been caught using the executive bathroom. She was throwing up, sir, Patricia explained. The regular bathroom was too far. Then she should have planned better. He waved his hand dismissively. Have her blacklisted from all Sterling properties. As sunset painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold and blood, Richard stood at his window, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand. Below, the city moved like a complex machine, and he was its master. Sir? Patricia's voice was tentative. That boy is back. Security says he's been asking questions about the building, about you specifically. Richard's hand tightened on the glass. Have him removed. And Patricia? Make sure he understands that if he comes back, there will be consequences. But as he watched the security guards approach the boy, something made him lean closer to the window. The way the boy stood his ground, chin lifted in defiance, it was like looking at a ghost, or a mirror. The photograph seemed to grow heavier in his pocket. 15 years. 15 years since he had made the choice that secured his empire. 15 years since he had signed away his newborn son, convinced by his father that a single parent couldn't build a business empire. Sentiment is weakness, his father had said. Choose now, your ambitions or this burden. He had chosen, and now he had everything. The empire, the power, the fear of others. Everything except... Richard turned away from the window as the guards grabbed the boy. He didn't want to see this. Just like he never looked at that photograph, never allowed himself to wonder, to feel. Cancel my remaining meetings, he told Patricia, and get me the file on that hotel chain. Mark's weakness is his son's private school tuition. We'll start there. Because that's what power was. The ability to break things, to break people, to break yourself so thoroughly that nothing could ever hurt you again. The price of power was everything human inside you. And Richard Sterling had paid that price in full. Or so he thought. Gabriel wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve, his eyes fixed on the towering glass building that seemed to pierce the Manhattan sky. For 3 days now he'd been watching, learning the patterns of the guards, the rhythm of the corporate workers who streamed in and out like ants serving their queen. But it wasn't the building that drew him. It was the man in the top-floor office, the one they called the King of Manhattan. You're going to get yourself in trouble again, Maria warned, her weathered face creased with concern. At 60, she was the closest thing to a mother figure the street kids had. That building isn't for people like us. But Gabriel wasn't listening. His hand clutched the crumpled newspaper article he'd found. Richard Sterling, the self-made billionaire. The man's face in the photo stirred something deep inside him, a memory perhaps, or just another false hope. I need to know, he muttered, more to himself than to Maria. Something's not right. The dates match. A sleek car pulled up to the curb, and Dr. Laura Chen stepped out, her medical bag in hand. Every Thursday, she ran the free clinic for street children, but she always checked on Gabriel first. She'd been intrigued by him since the day she found him teaching younger street kids to read using discarded newspapers. Still stalking billionaires? She asked, approaching with the direct manner that had earned her the street kids' trust. You missed your checkup yesterday. Gabriel turned to her, and once again Dr. Laura was struck by his eyes, intelligent, determined, and somehow familiar. I think he might be my father, he said quietly. The birth certificate you helped me find, the dates, the hospital, everything fits. Dr. Laura frowned. She'd seen too many street kids build elaborate fantasies about their origins, but something about this was different. The resemblance she'd noticed, the age, the hospital records. Gabriel, even if it's true. He has my eyes, Gabriel interrupted, pulling out the newspaper. The photo was smudged from being carried around, but Richard Sterling's piercing gaze was unmistakable. And look at this. He pointed to a detail in the article about a woman named Helena, a marriage that ended 15 years ago. Dr. Laura felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had seen those same eyes in her clinic, had wondered about the aristocratic bone structure that seemed out of place on a street child. I need to get inside, Gabriel continued, watching as employees flashed their badges at security. Just for a minute. Just to see him up close. What you need is to eat, Dr. Laura said firmly, pulling an energy bar from her bag. And to let me check that cough. Have you been going through the dumpsters again? Gabriel accepted the bar but didn't eat it. His eyes remained fixed on the top floor. Did you know he fires people every day? Just yesterday, a whole department. I watched them leave crying. He paused, his voice dropping. Is that what he did to my mother? Just disposed of her? Dr. Laura sat beside him on the concrete barrier that separated the corporate plaza from the street. Above them, Richard Sterling's empire gleamed in the morning sun. But down here, in the shadows, Manhattan's forgotten children fought for survival. Your mother, Dr. Laura said carefully, would have wanted you to be safe. Coming here, confronting him, it's dangerous, Gabriel. But she could see he wasn't listening. There was something in his determination that reminded her of the man in the tower. The same intensity, the same unwavering focus. The resemblance was becoming harder to ignore. A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Security was escorting someone out. Another fired employee, probably. Gabriel watched with a mixture of disgust and fascination. He thinks he's untouchable, Gabriel said. Up there in his tower, playing God with people's lives. He stood suddenly, brushing off his worn jeans. I'm going in. Gabriel, don't. But he was already moving, weaving through the morning crowd with the skill of someone who'd learned to be invisible. Laura watched as he slipped past the first security checkpoint, blending in with a group of young interns. Her hand went to her phone, then stopped. As a doctor, she had access to the hospital's records. With a DNA test. But no, that would be unethical, wouldn't it? Through the massive glass doors, she could see Gabriel in the lobby now, his worn sneakers incongruous against the marble floors. Security hadn't noticed him yet, but it was only a matter of time. Sometimes, Maria said beside her, making her jump, the truth needs a little help coming out. Dr. Laura watched as Gabriel moved closer to the elevators. In her bag was a DNA collection kit, standard equipment for her street clinic. One sample from Gabriel, who trusted her, and one from Richard Sterling, somehow. The truth, she murmured, or karma. Above them, in his tower of glass and steel, Richard Sterling went about his morning routine, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collide with the reality he'd tried to forget. And down below, his son, a boy who'd learned to survive despite everything, was about to set in motion events that would shatter both their worlds. Dr. Laura made her decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed the hospital's genetics lab. Some rules were meant to be broken, especially when karma needed a little scientific help. In the lobby, Gabriel had reached the elevators. For a moment, he looked back, and in his face, Dr. Laura saw the future rushing toward them all like an oncoming storm. The price of truth was about to be paid in full. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Sterling Tower's glass facade as Gabriel made his final approach. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained calm, a survival skill learned on Manhattan's unforgiving streets. The newspaper clipping felt heavy in his pocket, like a stone weighing him down. Inside the lobby, everything gleamed. The marble floors reflected the light like water, making Gabriel's worn sneakers seem even more out of place. A giant portrait of Richard Sterling dominated the entrance wall, his stern gaze following visitors everywhere, the king surveying his domain. Hey you, A security guard's voice cut through the morning bustle. "Stop right there." Gabriel froze, but not from fear. Through the revolving doors, he could see a black Maserati pulling up to the curb. Richard Sterling was arriving for his 9 a.m. meeting. Time slowed down. The security guard was reaching for him. Laura was rushing through the doors, calling his name. And Richard Sterling was stepping out of his car, immaculate in his tailored suit, radiating power and disdain. Their worlds collided in slow motion. "I need to talk to you," Gabriel's voice carried across the lobby, strong and clear despite his racing heart. "Mr. Sterling," Richard turned, irritation flashing across his face. The boy's voice had drawn the attention of arriving employees, creating exactly the kind of scene he despised. "Remove him," Richard commanded the security guards, not even looking at Gabriel directly. "And make sure he understands not to return." But Gabriel was faster than the guards. He darted forward, pulling the crumpled newspaper from his pocket. "I know who you are. I know what you did 15 years ago." That got Richard's attention. He turned fully now, his cold eyes fixing on Gabriel for the first time. For a moment, brief but electric, something passed between them. Recognition? Fear? Or just the shared intensity of two unmovable forces? "Sir," the head of security stepped forward, "we'll handle this." "Wait." Richard's voice was sharp. He studied Gabriel with the same calculating gaze he used to evaluate acquisitions. "You have 30 seconds to explain yourself before I have you arrested for trespassing." Gabriel stood his ground, chin lifted in defiance. "Lenox Hill Hospital, June 12th, 15 years ago. You signed away your rights to a baby boy, your son." The lobby fell silent. Even the morning bustle seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Richard's face remained impassive, but his hand twitched slightly, a microscopic tell that only Dr. Laura, watching intently from the sidelines, noticed. "You're delusional," Richard said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Security, remove this vagrant and call the police." "I have proof." Gabriel pulled out more papers, photocopies of hospital records Dr. Laura had helped him obtain. "Your signature is on my birth certificate. You can't deny." "I can deny whatever I want." Richard stepped closer, towering over Gabriel. "I am Richard Sterling. I own half the city. And you? You're nothing but garbage, digging through my dumpsters, staining my lobby with your filth." The cruelty was calculated, designed to wound. But Gabriel didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a cold, familiar smile that made several onlookers gasp. It was Richard's own expression, reflected back at him like a mirror. "That's where you're wrong," Gabriel said quietly. "I'm not nothing. I'm your biggest mistake." Richard moved with unexpected speed. His hand shot out, grabbing Gabriel's collar. "Listen to me, you little—" "Don't touch him," Dr. Laura intervened, pushing between them. In the chaos, her medical bag knocked against Richard's chest, and his pristine white handkerchief fell to the floor. Gabriel stumbled backward, his lip bleeding from where it had caught on his teeth. A drop of blood fell, staining the handkerchief before anyone could move. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Laura said, her voice steady as she picked up the bloodied handkerchief. "You don't want to do this. Not here. Not now." Richard looked around, suddenly aware of the phones recording the scene, of the whispers spreading through the crowd. His carefully controlled image was cracking. "Get out," he snarled at Gabriel. "If I ever see you near my building again—" "You'll what?" Gabriel's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "Throw me away again? Like you did 15 years ago?" The words hit Richard like physical blows. For a split second, his mask slipped, and something like pain flashed across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by fury. "I don't have a son," he said, each word precise and cutting. "I never had a son. You're nothing but a street rat trying to extort money from a successful man. It's pathetic." Dr. Laura watched the scene unfold, the bloodied handkerchief now safely in her bag. Sometimes karma needed a little help, and sometimes it arrived wrapped in cotton and stained with the truth. "This isn't over," Gabriel said, backing toward the doors. His eyes, so like Richard's, were bright with unshed tears and determination. You can't hide from the truth forever. Watch me. Richard straightened his tie, his composure returning like armor. Patricia, call my lawyers. I want a restraining order. And you, he pointed at Gabriel, remember this moment. Remember what happens when you try to climb too high above your station. The gathered crowd parted as Gabriel walked out, his head held high despite the humiliation. Dr. Laura followed him, but not before giving Richard one last, knowing look. You're right, Mr. Sterling, she said softly as she passed him. This isn't over, it's just beginning. Outside, the Manhattan morning continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. In her bag, Dr. Laura carried the key to unraveling 15 years of denial, a blood-stained handkerchief that would soon tell its own truth. Richard watched them go, his face a mask of indifference, but his hand strayed to his inner pocket, where an old photograph lay hidden, and for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to really look at the boy's face. The resemblance was undeniable, but so was the price of truth. Richard Sterling hadn't left his office in 36 hours. Empty coffee cups littered his desk, and his usual immaculate appearance had begun to crack around the edges. The DNA results lay before him like a ticking bomb, each number and percentage a countdown to the destruction of everything he'd built. Cancel my meetings for the next 2 days, he barked into the intercom, and get me everything you can find on Dr. Laura Chen. Everything. Sir? Patricia's voice was hesitant. The press is asking about this morning's incident. There's a video circulating. Richard's hand clenched around his crystal tumbler. Of course there was a video. There was always a video these days. His public humiliation of a street boy, his son, captured and shared for the world to see. His phone buzzed, another message from the board of directors. They were concerned about recent events. Corporate speak for, you're becoming a liability. Mr. Sterling, Patricia again. Your father's old lawyer is here, Mr. Davidson. He says it's about the adoption papers from 15 years ago. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. James Davidson was a ghost from the past, one of the few people who knew the whole truth about that night at Lenox Hill Hospital. Send him in. Davidson hadn't changed much in 15 years. Still rail-thin, still wearing wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light like camera lenses. He carried a worn leather briefcase that Richard remembered all too well. You should have buried those papers deeper, Davidson said without preamble. The DA's office is asking questions. Richard stood, walking to the window. 50 floors below, the city continued its endless dance, unaware that its king was faltering. Fix it. Whatever it costs. It's not that simple anymore. Davidson opened his briefcase, spreading old documents across Richard's desk. Your father made me keep copies of everything. Insurance, he called it. The original adoption was irregular, rushed. There are signatures missing, dates that don't match. I was following my father's orders. Richard's composure cracked. He said the company would go to my cousin if I kept the child. Said a single father couldn't run an empire. He made me choose. And you chose the empire. Davidson's voice was neutral. But now that empire is built on a foundation that's about to crumble. The boy's mother. Don't. Richard's voice was razor sharp. Don't say her name. Isabella Santos didn't die in childbirth, Ricardo. That was another of your father's lies. She was paid off, sent to Europe. But she died last year, and her deathbed confession is now in the hands of a very ambitious district attorney. The crystal tumbler shattered against the wall. Richard barely noticed the expensive scotch dripping down the imported wallpaper. Get out, he whispered. Get out. But Davidson wasn't finished. He placed one final document on the desk, a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. A small obituary. Isabella Santos, 34, died in Paris. Survived by... Richard's phone buzzed again. Dr. Laura Chen. Your son is quite remarkable, her message read. Teaching other street children to read using discarded business newspapers. Your newspapers, actually. Life has a sense of irony, doesn't it? The walls of his empire were closing in. Somewhere in the city, a boy with his eyes and his mother's indomitable spirit was waiting for justice. And Richard Sterling, the king of Manhattan real estate, was about to learn that some debts can't be paid with money. His intercom buzzed one final time. "Soon? The board has called an emergency meeting. They're voting on your temporary suspension." Richard looked around his office. The temple to his success, built on a foundation of abandoned responsibilities and buried truths. The portrait of his father hung on the wall, stern and unforgiving even in death. "You were wrong, Father," he whispered to the painting. "Power isn't everything. I just learned that lesson 15 years too late." His phone buzzed again, an email from an anonymous account containing a single video attachment. With trembling fingers, he pressed play. It was security footage from 15 years ago. Lenox Hill Hospital, a younger version of himself, signing papers without reading them, desperate to please his father. And in the background, barely visible, a teenage girl crying as a nurse carried away a newborn baby. "Sir?" Patricia's voice was gentle now. "The press is gathering in the lobby. They're asking about Isabella Santos, about the adoption irregularities, about Gabriel." Gabriel, he had a name, not just the boy or the street kid or the mistake. Gabriel. Richard straightened his tie, a habit born of decades of controlling every situation. But this time, the situation was beyond control. The truth was rising like floodwater, threatening to drown everything he'd built. His empire was built on a single choice made 15 years ago, a choice that had turned him into his father. Cold, calculating, seeing people as assets or liabilities rather than human beings. And now, karma had brought his son back to his doorstep. Not as the heir to an empire, but as its destruction. The irony would have been beautiful if it wasn't so devastating. "Patricia," he said quietly, "tell the board I'll be there in 10 minutes, and find out where Gabriel is staying. He shouldn't be on the streets, not anymore." "Yes, sir." A pause. "Sir, the video of your confrontation has gone viral. Sterling Air is trending." Richard closed his eyes. In his pocket, the old photograph felt like it was burning a hole through his expensive suit, straight to whatever was left of his heart. The king of Manhattan was about to fall. And perhaps, just perhaps, a father would rise from the ruins. But first, there would be a reckoning, and it would be public, brutal, and absolutely deserved. Karma, after all, had waited 15 years for this moment. The Sterling Tower's main conference room had never felt so small. Richard stood at the window, watching his reflection fade into the gathering storm clouds outside. Behind him, 12 board members sat in weighted silence, their faces illuminated by the presentation screen displaying the viral video of his confrontation with Gabriel. "The markets are responding, Ricardo." Marcus Weber, head of the board, spoke first. "Our stock has dropped 15% since this morning. The media is calling it the Prince and the Pauper, Manhattan edition." The door opened. Dr. Laura Chen entered, followed by Gabriel. The boy was wearing clean clothes now, Dr. Laura's doing, no doubt, but his bearing remained unchanged. Proud, defiant, sterling to the core. "You have no right to be here," Richard started, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Actually," Dr. Laura placed a folder on the conference table, "we have every right. These DNA results give Gabriel a claim to—" "I don't want his money." Gabriel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I want the truth, all of it, here, now, in front of everyone." Thunder rolled outside and rain began to lash against the windows. Richard turned to face the room, his empire crumbling in real time. "The truth?" He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "The truth is that 15 years ago, I made a choice. Business over blood, power over responsibility. I became exactly what my father wanted me to be, a man who would sacrifice anything for success." "Mr. Sterling," Marcus interjected, "perhaps we should discuss this in private." "No." Gabriel stepped forward. "No more privacy. No more secrets." He pulled out a worn photograph, identical to the one Richard kept in his pocket. My mother kept this. Before she died in Paris last year, she wrote me a letter, told me everything. Richard's facade cracked. Isabella, she died? Like you care. Gabriel's voice trembled with rage. You sent her away with money and threats. She spent 15 years looking for me, and did you know that? While you were building this, he gestured at the tower around them. She was searching. And I was surviving on the streets outside your precious building. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Several phones were recording. Richard's humiliation would be complete, broadcast to the world that had feared him for so long. I did what I had to do, Richard whispered, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. Now. Gabriel slammed his hands on the conference table. You did what was easy, what was profitable. You want to know what's hard? Living on the streets, teaching yourself to read from thrown-away newspapers, watching other kids get adopted while you wonder why your own father threw you away like garbage. Dr. Laura stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Gabriel's shoulder. There's more, she said, opening another folder. The adoption papers were falsified. Isabella Santos never signed away her rights. Your father's lawyer arranged everything, created a false death certificate for her, and buried the evidence. The company will face serious legal repercussions, Marcus stated, his business mask cracking to reveal genuine shock. This could be considered trafficking. I don't care about your company. Gabriel's shout echoed off the glass walls. I care about 15 years of lies. About a mother who died thinking she failed to find me. About a father who, his voice broke, who looked me in the eye yesterday and called me nothing but garbage. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood frozen, watching his son, this stranger with his eyes and Isabella's fierce heart, shake with years of pent-up pain. Vote him out, Gabriel said to the board, his voice suddenly calm. Remove him from his throne, not for me, for everyone he's hurt, everyone he's discarded in his climb to the top. Richard moved then, reaching into his pocket for the photograph he'd carried for 15 years. It was worn at the edges, handled more often than he'd ever admit. I look at it every day, he confessed, his voice barely audible. Every single day. I told myself it was to remember the price of success, but really it was to punish myself, because I always knew I made the wrong choice. Mr. Sterling, Marcus stood, the board needs to vote now, given the circumstances. Give it all to him, Richard interrupted. The room fell silent. What? Gabriel stepped back, surprised. The company, the money, all of it. Richard's voice grew stronger. I'll sign everything over to you. It's yours by right, by blood. He laughed bitterly. Isn't that ironic, Father? He looked up at the portrait on the wall. Blood really is thicker than water, or muddy. I told you, Gabriel's voice shook. I don't want your empire. Then tear it down. Richard stepped closer to his son. Destroy everything I built. Turn the buildings into homeless shelters. Sell it all and give the money to street kids. I don't care anymore. Just let me try to fix what I broke. Please. The word please, never before heard from Richard's sterling lips, hung in the air like the aftermath of lightning. Gabriel looked at his father, really looked at him, for the first time. The mighty king of Manhattan was gone, replaced by a broken man reaching out across 15 years of mistakes. You can't fix this, Gabriel said quietly. Some things can't be fixed. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. But maybe they can be rebuilt, from the ground up, the right way this time. As Gabriel walked out, Dr. Laura following close behind, Richard Sterling, former king of Manhattan, sank into his chair. Outside, the storm raged on, washing the city clean. Sometimes, karma comes not to destroy, but to clear the ground for something new to grow. The question was, would either father or son be strong enough to plant those first seeds? The headlines exploded across Manhattan like wildfire. Sterling empire crumbles. Billionaire's secret son revealed. From street to suit, the heir who lived in shadows. Corporate kings fall. DNA confirms shocking truth. Richard Sterling sat alone in his penthouse, watching the media frenzy unfold on multiple screens. His phone hadn't stopped ringing for hours. Reporters, shareholders, old friends suddenly turned vultures. On every channel, the video of his confrontation with Gabriel played on loop, each replay another nail in his empire's coffin. "Sir?" Patricia's voice came through the intercom. "The stock has fallen another 20%. The major shareholders are demanding an emergency meeting." "Let it fall," Richard whispered, his eyes fixed on a frozen frame of Gabriel's face. The resemblance that he'd tried so hard to deny now screamed at him from every pixel. His laptop pinged with a new email. From James Davidson, his father's old lawyer. "The DA is opening a formal investigation into the adoption irregularities. Destruction of evidence, falsification of documents, possible human trafficking charges. This goes beyond civil court, Ricardo. They're talking criminal charges. I'm retiring to the Cayman Islands. Good luck." The irony wasn't lost on him. His father had orchestrated everything 15 years ago to protect the company. And now those very actions were destroying it. His phone buzzed again. Dr. Laura Chen. "He's safe," her message read, "but he's not okay. 15 years of trauma don't disappear with one dramatic revelation. He needs time." Time. The one commodity Richard Sterling couldn't buy with all his billions. The elevator pinged and Marcus Weber strode in looking grave. "The board's decision is unanimous. Effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation. We're appointing an interim CEO to handle—" "Take it," Richard interrupted, still staring at Gabriel's frozen image. "Take it all." "What?" "The company, the position, the power. Take it." Richard finally turned to face his old friend and colleague. "I spent 15 years building an empire on the foundation of my biggest mistake. Maybe it's time that empire fell." Marcus sat heavily in one of the Italian leather chairs. "You're not thinking clearly. The company can survive this, with the right PR team, some strategic charitable donations. No." Richard's voice cracked like a whip. "No more manipulation. No more buying my way out." He pulled out his phone, showing Marcus the latest viral hashtag, "Justice for Gabriel." "The world has changed, Marcus. We can't just bury our sins in paperwork anymore. Everything comes to light eventually." "Your father." "My father was wrong." Richard stood, walking to the wall where his father's portrait had hung for years. Now it lay face down on the floor, its expensive frame cracked. "He taught me that power was everything, that emotions were weakness, that a man's worth was measured by the size of his empire." He laughed bitterly. "And look what that got me, a son who hates me, a woman I loved, dead in Paris without ever finding her child, an empire built on sand." His phone buzzed again. Another news alert. "Sterling heir, from street teacher to corporate royalty, Gabriel's story of survival." The article detailed how Gabriel had taught other street children to read, how he'd survived by his wits and determination, how he'd never stopped searching for the truth about his origins. "He's twice the man I am," Richard whispered, "living on nothing, yet giving everything to others. While he gestured at the luxurious penthouse, "I've lived on everything and given nothing." Marcus stood, straightening his tie, a nervous habit he'd learned from Ricardo. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 15 years ago." Richard picked up his father's portrait, staring into those cold, demanding eyes one last time. "Choose my son." He walked to his desk, pulling out papers he'd had his lawyers prepare through the night. "I'm transferring controlling interest in the company to a trust. Gabriel will be the primary beneficiary, but he'll have full discretion on how to use it. If he wants to turn every Sterling building into a homeless shelter, so be it. The shareholders will revolt. Let them." Richard signed the papers with the same flourish he'd used on those adoption documents 15 years ago. Maybe it's time for a revolt. Maybe it's time for everything to change. His phone buzzed one final time. Dr. Laura again. He's asking about his mother, about Isabella, about those last days at the hospital. He deserves to know everything, Ricardo, all of it. Richard closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Isabella's tears, his father's ultimatum, the weight of a newborn in his arms, so brief, so precious, so carelessly discarded. "Marcus," he said quietly, "call a press conference, full media coverage. It's time for the whole truth." "Richard, think about..." "I've thought about nothing else for 15 years. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a well-worn journal. "Isabella kept a diary. She sent it to me last year, he swallowed hard. "Before she died, I never opened it. I was too much of a coward. But Gabriel needs to see it. The world needs to see it." Thunder rolled outside. The same storm that had started during the board meetings still raged on. Nature itself seemed to be washing Manhattan clean of its sins. "Sir?" Patricia's voice again. "Dr. Laura Chen is here, with Gabriel." Richard's hand trembled as he pressed the intercom. "Send them up." Marcus headed for the door, pausing only briefly. "The empire you built, it really meant everything to you." Richard looked out at the city, his city, or what had been his city. In the reflection of the rain-streaked windows, he saw himself as he truly was. Not a king, but a man who had traded his soul for a crown of thorns. "Not everything," he whispered. "Not anymore." The elevator was ascending. His son was coming, and Richard Sterling, former king of Manhattan, prepared to kneel before the prince he had cast aside. Sometimes losing an empire is the only way to save your soul. The elevator doors opened to reveal Gabriel and Dr. Laura, both soaked from the storm that continued to batter Manhattan. For a moment, no one moved. The penthouse's oppressive silence was broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against floor-to-ceiling windows. Isabella's diary lay on Richard's desk like a bomb waiting to detonate. "You look tired," Gabriel said finally, his voice neither kind nor cruel, just observant. The mighty Richard Sterling, brought low by truth. Richard didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he picked up the diary with trembling hands. "Your mother wrote this. She sent it to me last year before." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Before she died alone in Paris," Gabriel completed, his words sharp as broken glass. "Like she lived alone." Dr. Laura moved to intervene, but Gabriel waved her off. He approached the desk, his worn sneakers silent against the imported marble floors. Water dripped from his clothes, leaving small puddles, marks of the real world intruding into Richard's sterile sanctuary. "Read it," Richard said, extending the diary. "All of it. You deserve to know." Gabriel took the diary but didn't open it. Why now? Why not last year when she sent it, or 15 years ago when it mattered? "Because I was a coward." The admission hung in the air. "Because my father taught me that power was everything, and I was too weak to prove him wrong." A bitter laugh escaped Gabriel. "Weak? You? The great Richard Sterling?" "The weakest man in Manhattan," Richard corrected. "It takes strength to love, Gabriel. To choose family over fortune. I didn't have that strength." Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating father and son in stark relief, their similarities even more apparent in the electric flash. Gabriel finally opened the diary, his fingers gentle with this last piece of his mother. The first page made him catch his breath. "My dearest baby boy, if you're reading this, I failed to find you, but you need to know, you were loved. From the first moment, you were so loved." His hands began to shake. Dr. Laura stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "She never stopped looking," Richard said quietly. "Every year she would send me updates, which orphanages she'd checked, which streets she'd searched. I deleted them all, unread." "You knew?" Gabriel's voice cracked. "All those years I was right outside your building, you knew she was looking for me." "I convinced myself it was better this way, that you'd been adopted by a good family, that you were happy somewhere." Richard's composure finally shattered. "I never imagined, never let myself imagine, that I was sleeping in cardboard boxes in the shadow of your tower?" Gabriel's laugh was hollow. "That I was teaching myself to read using discarded newspapers with your face on them?" He turned pages in the diary, his mother's elegant handwriting blurring through his tears. "She was brilliant," Richard said softly. "A scholarship student, top of her class, My father said she was beneath us, that she was after our money, but she never wanted it. She just wanted a family, Gabriel finished, reading from the diary. She just wanted us to be a family. The word hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. The company is yours, Richard said suddenly. Everything. I've signed it all over to a trust in your name. Gabriel looked up sharply. You think that fixes anything? No. Richard sank into his chair. Nothing fixes this, but you can do better. Be better. Turn it all into something good, something she would have been proud of. She was proud of me anyway, Gabriel said, still reading. She wrote about seeing me once, 3 years ago, teaching kids behind your building. She didn't know it was me, but she wrote about hope, about seeing kindness survive in the hardest places. His voice broke. Laura moved closer, but Gabriel straightened, forcing back tears. You want redemption? He asked Ricardo. Start with the truth. All of it. Not just to me, to everyone. Every dirty detail, every backroom deal, every life you destroyed climbing to your throne. Richard nodded slowly. The press conference is already arranged. Full media coverage, no filters, no PR spin. And then, Richard stood, walking to the windows. The storm was beginning to clear, the first rays of sunset breaking through. Then I'll do whatever you want. Resign. Turn myself in to the DA. Anything. Gabriel opened the diary to its final pages. His mother's last words made him pause. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, my son. It's about choosing to build something new from the ruins of what was broken. He looked up at his father, this stranger who shared his blood, his eyes, his stubborn chin. This man who had everything and nothing. I don't forgive you, Gabriel said clearly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Richard nodded, accepting the judgment. But, Gabriel continued, maybe we can build something new. Not for you. Not even for me. For all the other kids out there sleeping in cardboard boxes while men in towers count their millions. He placed the diary carefully on the desk. I'll take the company, but we do this my way. Every Sterling property becomes part shelter, part school. Every profit funds education for street kids. Every brick of your empire becomes a step up for someone who needs it. Yes, Richard whispered, anything. And you? Gabriel's eyes, Isabella's eyes really, fixed on his father. You work for it. All of it. No hiding in your tower. I want you on the streets, serving meals, teaching classes, getting your hands dirty with the reality you ignored for so long. The sun broke through fully now, painting the office in shades of gold and shadow. Father and son stood in its light, the diary between them like a contract written in tears and truth. When do we start? Richard asked. Gabriel picked up the diary, holding it close. We already have, the moment you chose truth over power. He turned to leave, then paused. Mom would have liked that choice. 15 years late, but she would have liked it. Dr. Laura followed him to the elevator, leaving Richard alone with the sunset and his thoughts. The empire he'd built was ending, but maybe something better, something real, was finally beginning. Sometimes redemption doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes it just looks like the chance to build something new from the ruins of what you destroyed. The Sterling Tower's main auditorium had never been so full. Journalists from every major network crowded the space, cameras flashing like artificial lightning. On the stage, Richard Sterling stood behind a podium, his usual immaculate appearance now deliberately disheveled, his first act of honest presentation to the world. Gabriel sat in the front row between Dr. Laura and Marcus Weber, his mother's diary clutched in his hands like a shield. The past 24 hours had transformed him from a street kid to the most talked-about heir in Brazil, but his expression remained unchanged. Watchful, wary, wise beyond his years. 15 years ago, Richard began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, I made a choice that defined not just my life, but the lives of everyone in this story. Today, I'm here to confess that choice and all the choices that followed. The room fell silent. Even the most hardened journalists leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was coming. My father, Eduardo Sterling, built this company on a simple principle: power at any cost. When I fell in love with a scholarship student named Isabella Santos, he saw it as a threat to his legacy. When she became pregnant, he saw it as a disaster. And when my son was born, Richard's voice cracked. He saw an opportunity to test my loyalty to his vision. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Richard pulled out old documents: the falsified adoption papers, the fake death certificate, the financial transfers that had bought silence. My father offered me a choice: my inheritance or my child, the company or my son, power or love. He looked directly at Gabriel. I chose wrong. I chose power. And that choice set in motion 15 years of corruption, lies, and human collateral damage that I'm here to expose today. He began to list it all: every corrupt deal, every destroyed life, every act of corporate violence that had built his empire. The journalist's fingers flew across keyboards, recording the fall of Manhattan's business king in real time. The mother of my child, Isabella Santos, didn't die in childbirth, as the records show. She was forced into exile, paid to disappear. She spent 15 years searching for our son, never giving up, never stopping, He gestured at the towering building around them, while I built monuments to my own cowardice. In the front row, Gabriel opened the diary, reading his mother's words as his father confessed his sins. My darling boy, if you're reading this, know that every step I took, every street I searched, was worth it, just for the chance of finding you. Love doesn't die. It just waits to be rediscovered. The boy I cast aside, Richard continued, his voice growing stronger, survived, not because of me, but in spite of me. While I sat in my tower counting billions, my son slept on these streets. While I destroyed lives in boardrooms, he taught other homeless children to read. While I built an empire on lies, he built a community on truth. The cameras swung to Gabriel, who met their gaze steadily, unflinching. Today, Richard straightened behind the podium, justice demands its due. I've signed over controlling interest in the Sterling Group to a trust in my son's name. But more than that, I'm here to confess to all applicable crimes related to the fraudulent adoption, document falsification, and corporate corruption that followed. A gasp rippled through the room. This wasn't the PR spin they'd expected. This was career suicide, possibly literal suicide. Mr. Sterling, a reporter called out, are you saying you're willing to face criminal charges? Yes. The word fell like a gavel. I've already contacted the district attorney's office. After this conference, I'll be surrendering myself to their custody. The room erupted. Cameras flashed frantically. Questions flew from all directions, but Richard kept his eyes on Gabriel, watching as his son slowly stood. The room fell silent again as Gabriel walked to the stage. Father and son faced each other under the glare of 100 cameras. 15 years ago, Gabriel spoke, his voice clear and strong. A man chose power over love, wealth over family, lies over truth. Today, that same man chooses to fall so that justice can rise. He turned to face the cameras. The Sterling Group will be transformed. Every property will include shelter space and educational facilities for homeless youth. Every profit will fund programs to prevent other children from experiencing what I did. The empire built on corruption will be rebuilt on compassion. Richard stepped away from the podium, offering it to his son. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, the king abdicating to the prince he'd once abandoned. My mother wrote something in her final days, Gabriel continued, opening the diary. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration, about taking what was broken and making it whole in a new way. He looked at his father. Richard Sterling will face legal consequences for his actions. But his true punishment, his true justice, will be to work, not from this tower, but on the streets, teaching, serving, helping the people he once ignored, converting every brick of his empire into a step up for someone who needs it. The cameras caught it all. The fallen king and the risen prince, the past giving way to the future, karma delivering its perfect justice. Sometimes, Gabriel concluded, The greatest power isn't in what we take, but in what we give back. As father and son left the stage, one to face justice, one to build a new legacy. The diary's final words echoed in both their minds. Love waits. Truth prevails. And sometimes, my son, karma doesn't come to punish us, but to point us toward the path we should have taken all along. Outside, the Manhattan sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the Sterling Tower, no longer a monument to power, but a beacon of transformation. Sometimes justice comes not to destroy but to rebuild. Not to end a story, but to begin a better one. And in that moment, watching his father led away by authorities, Gabriel finally understood. Karma's greatest justice isn't in the punishment it delivers, but in the restoration it makes possible. 3 months later, the Sterling Tower looked different. The marble lobby, once a testament to corporate power, now hosted rows of desks where former street children studied under volunteer teachers. The sign outside read, Sterling Foundation, Education, Shelter, Hope. Richard Sterling, wearing simple clothes instead of his trademark suits, sat among the children, helping a young boy with his mathematics. His house arrest ankle monitor peeked out from under his jeans. A constant reminder of justice in progress. The courts had agreed to a novel sentence. While awaiting trial, he would work directly with the communities he had once ignored. Mr. Ricardo, the boy tugged at his sleeve. I don't understand this problem. Let's break it down step by step, Richard replied, his voice gentle, a tone that would have been unrecognizable 3 months ago. Sometimes the biggest problems become simple when we face them one piece at a time. From the mezzanine above, Gabriel watched the scene unfold. Dr. Laura stood beside him, reviewing the latest transformation plans. The West Wing conversion is almost complete, she reported. 20 more shelter beds, a medical clinic, and a job training center. Your mother would be proud. Gabriel touched the diary in his pocket, his constant companion now. She wrote about this, you know. Not this exactly, but something like it. She had plans for a foundation, for education programs. She never stopped believing in the power of second chances. Below, Richard looked up, meeting his son's gaze. 3 months of daily interaction hadn't erased 15 years of absence, but something was growing in the space between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The board meeting is in an hour, Dr. Laura reminded gently. They're still resistant to the full transformation plan. Gabriel nodded, straightening his shoulders. He wore a suit now, but not like his father's old armor of tailored menace. This was a tool, not a weapon. Then let's show them what real power looks like, he said, heading toward the conference room. The board members were already seated when Gabriel entered, their expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. These were men cut from the same cloth as the old Richard Sterling, believers in power at any cost. The numbers don't lie, Marcus Weber began, projecting spreadsheets onto the screen. These social programs are eating into our profits. The shareholders are concerned. Show them the other numbers, Gabriel interrupted, nodding to Dr. Laura. She pulled up a different presentation. In 3 months, she began, we've provided shelter to over 200 homeless youth. 50 have completed basic education certificates. 30 have found employment through our job training program. And our corporate partners. Corporate partners? Marcus scoffed. Yes, Gabriel stepped forward. Companies that understand that social responsibility isn't charity, it's good business. Every child we educate, every family we help, becomes part of the economy, part of the solution. He pulled out his mother's diary. My mother wrote that true wealth isn't measured in what we keep, but in what we give back. She was right, and the markets are proving it. Dr. Laura switched to another slide, showing the company's stock price. After the initial plunge, it had stabilized and was now climbing steadily. The world is changing, Gabriel continued. People want companies with conscience, partners with purpose. We're not just transforming lives, we're transforming what corporate success looks like. From the back of the room, Richard spoke up. The board members turned, some seeing him for the first time since his fall. He stood straighter now, despite the ankle monitor and simple clothes. "I built this company on fear," he said quietly. "My son is rebuilding it on hope. And if you look at those numbers carefully, you'll see which foundation is stronger." One by one, the board members studied the projections. The transformation plan wasn't just ethical, it was profitable. Companies were lining up to partner with the new Sterling Foundation, eager to be part of the redemption story. "There's something else," Gabriel added, gesturing to Dr. Laura. She distributed new folders to each board member. "Starting next month, every executive in the Sterling Group will spend 1 week per quarter working directly in our social programs. Teaching, serving, learning. No exceptions." "You can't be serious," Marcus protested. "Actually, he can," Richard interjected. "The trust gives him full authority, and speaking as someone who's done it, it's not a punishment, it's an education." The meeting ended with reluctant acceptance. As the board members filed out, Gabriel approached his father. "You didn't have to speak up," he said, "but thank you." Richard nodded, glancing at his ankle monitor. "The judge says I'm making progress. The prosecution might consider a plea deal, focusing on restoration rather than punishment." "Good," Gabriel replied, "because we need you. Not the old you, the one who's emerging now, the one who finally understands what real power is." They walked together to the window, looking out over Manhattan. The city seemed different now, not a kingdom to be conquered, but a community to be lifted. "Your mother," Richard said softly, "she used to talk about changing the world. I thought she was naive, but she saw something I couldn't. That real change starts with changing ourselves." Gabriel touched the diary in his pocket. She wrote that too, that the greatest revolutions start in the heart. Below them, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, where Richard had once humiliated his unknown son. Now that same plaza hosted food banks and medical clinics. The security guards who had once chased away street children now helped them carry books and supplies. "We're not done," Gabriel said firmly. "This is just the beginning." Richard looked at his son, this extraordinary young man who had survived his greatest mistake and turned it into a miracle of transformation. "No," he agreed. "We're not done. We're just starting to understand what's possible when we choose love over power, hope over fear, restoration over destruction." As they stood there, father and son, watching their new world take shape, Isabella's words echoed through time. "The greatest power isn't in what we build, but in what we rebuild. Not in what we achieve, but in what we restore." The path to redemption was long, but they had taken the first steps together. 1 year later, the Sterling Tower's main lobby buzzed with anticipation. Journalists, business leaders, and social workers gathered for what the press was calling the Miracle of Manhattan, the 1-year anniversary of the transformation that had changed not just a company, but an entire city's approach to corporate responsibility. Gabriel stood at the podium, no longer the uncertain street boy, but a leader who had found his own kind of power. Behind him, a large photo of Isabella Santos smiled down at the assembly, her presence finally acknowledged in the building that had once denied her existence. 1 year ago, Gabriel began, we started an experiment. We asked ourselves, what if corporate power could be used not just to build wealth, but to rebuild lives? What if success could be measured not in what we take, but in what we give? The numbers told their story on the screens behind him. 1,000 plus homeless youth provided with shelter and education. 500 successful job placements. 30 Sterling properties converted into dual-purpose facilities. Stock value up 40% from the previous year. But it was the smaller screen, showing live feeds from various Sterling facilities across the city that told the real story. In each frame, former street children studied, learned trades, and built futures. But today isn't about numbers, Gabriel continued. It's about transformation. And no transformation has been more profound than this one. He gestured to the side of the stage, where Richard Sterling waited. Gone was the ankle monitor, replaced by a simple bracelet made by the children in their art therapy program. The former corporate titan now walked with a different kind of confidence. Not the arrogance of power, but the quiet strength of purpose. Richard joined his son at the podium, and for a moment, they stood together under Isabella's smiling gaze. "My father once taught me that power was everything," Richard spoke, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "He was wrong. Love is everything. Purpose is everything. The chance to repair what we've broken, that's everything." From her seat in the front row, Dr. Laura Chen watched the men she'd helped bring together. The past year had been a journey of healing, not just for them, but for an entire community. Her clinic, now fully funded and expanded, had become a model for corporate-sponsored healthcare initiatives across Brazil. "We're here today," Gabrielle resumed, "to announce the next phase of our transformation. The Sterling Foundation is expanding. Every major corporation in Manhattan has pledged to join our initiative. 20 new facilities will open next year. But more importantly," he paused, opening the diary that had become his guidebook. "My mother wrote, 'Dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to bloom.' Today we're launching the Isabella Santos Scholarship, a full ride for 100 underprivileged students each year to attend university." The applause was thunderous, but it wasn't finished. "And finally," Gabriel looked at his father, nodding slightly, "we're announcing the complete conversion of the Sterling Tower. The upper floors, once reserved for corporate offices, will become dormitories and classrooms. The penthouse, where my father once ruled his empire, will be a library and study center." Richard stepped forward again. "The judge asked me recently if I've learned my lesson. The truth is, I learn it every day. From the children we help, from the lives we touch, and most importantly, from my son, who taught me that true power lies not in what we control, but in what we set free." The screens behind them changed, showing new images, the future plans for the Sterling Tower. The cold corporate aesthetic would give way to warm, welcoming spaces. The marble and chrome would be replaced by classrooms and community centers. "1 year ago," Gabriel concluded, "a father and son stood in this lobby as strangers. Today we stand here as partners in a dream bigger than ourselves." My mother wrote in her final entry, "The greatest legacy we can leave isn't in the buildings we build, but in the lives we change." He turned to his father, extending his hand. Richard took it, and for a moment, under Isabella's watchful gaze, the circle of pain and redemption closed. The applause that followed wasn't just for them. It was for every life touched, every future changed, every wrong made right. Later that evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, father and son stood in what had once been Richard's penthouse office. The space was already being transformed, the imposing desk replaced by study tables, the power art giving way to inspirational quotes, many from Isabella's diary. "She would have loved this," Richard said softly, touching the diary in Gabriel's hands. "All of it." Gabriel nodded, looking out over the city, their city, but in a different way now. Not as owners, but as stewards. Not as rulers, but as servants. "The hard part's just beginning," he said. "Real change takes time." "Yes," Richard agreed, "but we have time now, and each other." Below them, the lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars fallen to earth. In the distance, they could see other corporate towers, their next frontiers for change. The Sterling miracle was spreading, transforming not just lives, but the very nature of power and success in the corporate world. Gabriel opened the diary one last time, reading the words that had guided their transformation. "My dearest boy, remember this. Every ending is just a beginning in disguise. Every fall can lead to flight. And love, true love, never fails. It just takes unexpected paths to find its way home." Father and son stood together in the gathering dusk, at no longer the king and the abandoned prince, but partners in a revolution of the heart. The power they wielded now wasn't measured in money or control, but in the lives they touched and the hopes they kindled. The Sterling Empire hadn't fallen, it had been reborn. And in its rebirth, it had shown the world that the greatest power lies not in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we make possible for others. In the end, karma hadn't come to destroy, but to transform. And love, as Isabella had always believed, had found its way home. Loved this story? Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing inspiring tales every day. Stay tuned for the next captivating story coming your way soon. We're so grateful to have you with us. Don't forget to click the links on your screen right now to explore a hand-picked collection of amazing stories and endless entertainment. See you there?